The second half of the 20th century was dominated by a single overarching question. Will the world end? Two mega powers dominated the world. The Northern Hemisphere was a practical game of Russian roulette that somehow didn't result in war. There are two ways the Cold War could have been fought. The first of which would have been a nuclear war, which would have been the situation after around 1960, when both powers had intercontinental ballistic missiles, and so the Soviets could have bombed the North American continent itself. I've already made a video about this, or a world where the modern world ends in 1983 with the miscommunication that in our world nearly resulted in nuclear war. However, this video is about a different topic. It's about what if the Cold War was fought like any other war in history. Notably like World War II with tanks and offensives, and not a push-button war in which all of modern history would have ended in minutes. In all actuality, this sort of war was closer to occurring than many of you would think. What would have happened had the Soviets and Americans conventionally fought a war? What would the rest of history be like? How about borders, demographics, and culture? That's the question of this alternate history. You know, when I talk to my dad about the Cold War, he's always been thankful that he never did have to end up fighting the Soviets. But what if he did? What if the Lynches died out and what if Altus was never created? Fight out the epic battles of this war that never took place with Conflict of Nations, which is a free-to-play strategy game set in the modern world, where you can fight with 128 nations in real-time games that can take weeks to complete. They've made a new Cold War scenario where you play a real historic country and use diplomacy or engage in nuclear warfare in order to rewrite history. Can you lead the Russian bear to the Atlantic or liberate Eastern Europe? Click the link in the description to start playing this historically accurate Cold War scenario today. You can play with the same account on PC and mobile. Also, there's an exclusive What If Altus link for the next month which gives you 13,000 gold and 1 month free premium subscription for free. Fight the most epic war in history starting today. When people think of the Cold War, they tend to view it as a single struggle with the threat of total annihilation of the human race hanging over every second. That's understandable, but the early stages of the Cold War were pretty different. The Americans developed the atom bomb 6 years before the Soviets, and more importantly had far more atom bombs for a longer period of time. Also, the Soviets didn't have the potential to nuke North America itself into oblivion until around 1960-ish, while the Americans, due to European allies with closer proximity to Russia, could have done the same earlier. This meant that America had hegemony in atom bombs for the first 15 years of the Cold War. However, this didn't mean the Americans carried an immense advantage. The Soviets had 3 times America's troops parked inside Europe, meaning that without the atom bomb, the Soviets would have had an immense military superiority. A key point to keep in mind is that neither side had the military ability to wipe out the other with nuclear weapons in the early 1950s. The bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki were significantly weaker than those that we have today, or even those that would have been used in the 1960s due to the development of the hydrogen bomb in 1952. Even after which, it took several years to develop world-ending arsenals, meaning that a war in the early 1950s would have been a combination of nuclear strikes with waging what would amount to be a normal war. A war like this was closer to happening than many people would think, and there were several hinges in which it could have probably broken out. The first loose chink was that as the 1950s progressed, Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union, became progressively more paranoid. He thought that war with the United States and a war of capitalist aggression was inevitable. Similarly, he was hatching a plan to purge the Jewish doctors before his death and possibly launch another pogrom against the Jews, and there's a theory that his Jewish doctor killed him. Similarly, the top military command during the Korean War thought the US should have nuked China, which President Harry Truman overrided, but realistically, given Stalin's paranoia and the alliance between the two, this probably would have resulted in a war with the Soviets. The Russians were already having their air forces help out the Chinese in Korea anyway. There are a couple other potential points you could choose, like Churchill wanted to invade the Soviet Union, but they're all variations upon the broader same theory. It actually does matter which points you were to choose for the scenario to work out, since the Soviet nuclear abilities go up a tremendous amount between 1945 and 55. With the Soviets going from no nukes to massive arsenal. Let's say Stalin's paranoia is worse in this world and he comes to the conclusion that he needs to invade Western Europe during the Korean War when the Americans appear to be bogged down fighting against the Chinese. The Soviets had far greater numerical superiority over the Americans and so would have been able to push the Americans back in Western Europe, probably driving to the Rhine River in northern Italy, seizing Milan. However, Western Europe's extremely dense, which goes against the Soviet strategy of having big, sweeping army movements that are centrally directed, and America's Western European allies would be fighting for national survival. I think the Americans would be capable of fortifying the Rhine River strongly and creating a stable frontier there. The war in the Pacific would largely be sidelined. Korea is very mountainous, and I can't see the Russians putting significant effort into the front there. It would have stabilized with the Chinese, Americans, and two Koreas fighting in a nasty stalemate. I could see the US supporting the Chinese nationalists in Taiwan to try to re-seize power in China, which I don't think would work since the communists were still relatively popular at this point and China is so massive. It seems probable that there'd be anti-colonial rebellions in places like Africa and Southeast Asia, but I honestly don't think these would be large enough to change the trajectory of the war. The Soviet nuclear launch abilities weren't able to effectively reach America at this point, meaning they'd only be able to imprecisely bomb America. They could probably get a couple cities, but the Americans would be able to bomb Russia far more effectively. All of Europe would be devastated by nuclear exchange. Expect for the capital of France coming out of this war to be a place like Angers, and for the UK, York. Meanwhile, the capital of Russia would probably be some obscure place that I've never heard of. The US would probably face a couple nuclear strikes the Soviets would pull off by improving bomber technology, losing a couple major cities like New York, Los Angeles, or Washington. When you get down to it, this is a pretty simple war. There's only one front that really matters. It seems unlikely the Soviets would be able to drive the Americans into the English Channel with their massive army before the US could fully mobilize. The Soviets didn't do blitzkrieg or lightning-fast warfare. They wore down their opponents like an iceberg and then made breakthroughs. The Americans and their allies would have a larger population, better technology, and a far larger industrial base. Similarly, America's allies would be fighting with much higher motivation against Russia's, who would largely be strong-armed into the war. Also, the Soviet rail, industrial, and command system was heavily centralized, meaning that they'd be really hurt by well-placed nuclear strikes. Realistically, with nuclear superiority and fighting a defensive war, if we're going to say anyone's going to win this war, it would be the US. Russia was so fanatically Stalinist, and all the alternative forms of leadership were crushed, that I don't see them having a revolution, even if their 30 biggest cities were nuked. The war would probably end in a ceasefire, returning the world to what it was before the war had started. The Americans wouldn't have the army to occupy Eastern Europe, and the Russians would have bloodied themselves too much to keep the war going. This war would have heavily weakened the Soviet bloc, which would have lost significant parts of its population. This would create a feeling of insecurity and would probably result in the collapse of the Soviet Union a generation earlier, as belief in communism would diminish and dwindle faster. Having been blunted, communism would have lost its allure as this irresistible force spreading around the whole world. This would have created profoundly negative effects in the Third World, where fear of communism resulted in massive land reform and getting rid of aristocratic estates that existed for centuries in places like Latin America, the Middle East, and Southeast Asia. As these societies would be shoved into the modern world, the aristocrats would have to go one way or the other, and so in places like Peru, Indonesia, and Egypt, we would have seen massive French Revolution-style revolutions in the 1980s, probably using native nationalist third world socialism as its rallying cry. Europe would be pretty ravaged from this war, as so many of its cities would have been nuked, nihilism and depression would grip the continent. Europe would lack even more self-confidence in our timeline. It wouldn't surprise me if even new messianic or art movements would arise from a continent that had such a traumatizing time since 1914. We would see that governments would be more willing to use nukes in their opponents since people would have been desensitized to them. The Americans might have dropped a nuclear bomb on North Vietnam, for example. Having had Europe and Russia nuked so hard would have positive effects in America and possibly China if it hadn't seen a lot of nuclear strikes, the two remaining world powers. The US losing its major cities would evolve to be a more conservative country, especially without the effects of the large New York diaspora that made a lot of states like Florida and North Carolina and the like switch further to the left. The US, having probably lost Washington, would move its capital to a place like Omaha, St. Louis, or Kansas City in the center of the country. Before we end, check out Conflict of Nations, which is a free online PvP strategy game with modern global warfare. They're also having an incredible Cold War map which you can get just by clicking the link in the description. Also, click the link in the description in the next month to get 13,000 gold and a 1-month free premium subscription. What a faultist, and thanks for watching. If you enjoyed that video, please like, comment, subscribe, or stay tuned for additional content. Or alternatively, check me out on Patreon, where I've got a couple hundred pages written of both my cultural history of America and my history of the world. Or alternatively, check out my Instagram or Twitter. As always, thanks so much for watching and have a great day.